Do you remember those stories that your parents told you? The stories of the really embarrassing things that you said when you were a kid that maybe mortified your parents? I can remember two, especially. The one was when I was very young and I was with my mom and I saw an African American for the first time, and I asked my mom, I said, "Mom, why is he so dirty?" And my mom, as you could imagine, was mortified because not only did he hear that, and by the way, he just simply smiled, but other people around her heard that as well, and as you can imagine, she was really, really embarrassed. The other time I remember, I think we were in the grocery store, and I saw a man with long hair and earrings. And I asked my mom in front of him and in front of other people, "Mom, I thought you said only girls have long hair and earrings." And this time the look was not even as pleasant as the first man, and she was mortified. Now, rightly or wrongly, the things that we say and that I say is a representation of my parents, right? And the people that would have heard me, even though I said innocent words and I didn't know what I was saying, they might have thought, well, what is his parents teaching them that he would say this kind of stuff? And so our parents' reputation is often on the line by the things that we do and say. And that's very similar with God. And I think we've got to see this, that from the very beginning, God's representation and His reputation has been on the line by what His kids, the Israelites, and even His leaders, Moses and Aaron, have said. And as we've seen the last few weeks, it's not always been pretty. Because time after time, the Israelites are complaining. They're complaining that they're hungry. They're complaining that they're slaves. They're complaining even when they got out of Egypt. They're complaining that they're thirsty. They're just constantly grumbling and moaning and complaining. And Moses hasn't been a whole lot better, at least at the beginning. Because remember what Moses said when God said, "I want you to lead my people"? He said, "Well, God, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know your name. I don't know what to say. I don't speak very well. God, I can't possibly go for you." And yet, time after time, God proved Himself faithful to Moses and to Aaron. Because God said, "Moses, I'll teach you what to say." God said, "Moses, I'll tell you what my name is." God said, "I will be the one who will lead you and lead my people out of Egypt." It was God who hardened Pharaoh's heart. It was God who did the 10 miraculous plagues in Egypt. It was God who killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. It was God who brought out His people with a mighty hand. It was God who parted the sea and let His people walk through on dry land. It was God who took that same sea and swallowed up and drowned the following Egyptians. It was God who took the people out into the wilderness and provided manna from heaven, water, and quail from the sky. And it was this same holy God who brought the people to the mountain where He would give them His holy 10 commandments to teach them how to live in the sight of this holy, powerful God. And yet, time after time, the way that God chose to be repaid, the way that the people repaid God was with sinfulness and ungratefulness and idolatry. Even though God had been faithful time after time. And in this story today, we have another instance where God's people are wandering in the wilderness. Because of their sinfulness, by the way, they've been wandering for the last 40 years. And now they're at the end of this wandering, and again, the people are thirsty. And that's an appropriate time to take a drink to remind us that the people were thirsty. And so what do? Just like they've always done, they begin to complain. They begin to grumble and complain. They say, "Moses, why'd you bring us out to this God-forsaken desert? There's no water here. I'm thirsty. Not only am I thirsty, but my animals are thirsty. And you just brought us out here to die. Did you bring us out of Egypt to die today because we're dying of thirst?" Right? And it's really easy for us to point the finger and say, "Can you believe these Israelites? For all that God's done for them, all they have to do is complain complain? And yet be honest. When you have a problem or a complaint or a situation, do you talk and complain more about the problem than you do praying for it? Right? It's really easy to do. It's a lot easier to talk about our problems than to pray about them. And I'm just as big a culprit. It's really easy for me if I'm tired or I'm stressed out to kind of lay it on the line for Susan. Right? To just dump it onto Susan rather than to pray about it. Or if you think of whenever you have financial difficulty, when there's more month and not as much money and the bills are coming in and the kids' things need prayed for, how often do we complain about our lack of money and resources than actually praying to God about it? And again, you could go on the line to how we do that, but I'm thinking about this election season, and I don't know if it's just me, but just getting really sick of advertisements and politicians. And it's really easy to complain about our government and how corrupt it is and how sleazy our politicians are. But isn't it easy to complain about our government than it is to pray for its leaders? And in fact, did you know that it's our God-given command to actually pray for our leaders? But oftentimes we just rather complain about it. And what we fail to recognize when we have a situation or a problem or a difficulty or a sickness is that it's often God who leads us to these waterless places. And do you know what I mean when I say waterless places? I'm talking about those places of desperation or discouragement, or the point where you fall on your knees and there's no way out of this particular situation. And the only way out of this valley of the shadow of death, which God leads us into, is if God's going to take us by the hand and pull us out. Because we are not going to get out of here on our own. And the reason that God sometimes brings us to these waterless places and to the valleys of the shadow of death is so that we realize we don't have enough strength or energy or resources to get out of here, and we have got to rely on God. We have got to rely on the God who made us and the God who's faithful, because God promises He will be faithful, He will be with us, He will bring us through this, even if it's not in the way that we would hope or expect or desire. But God proves Himself faithful. And yet Israel complained to Moses and to Aaron. And what Moses and Aaron initially did is what you and I should have done and should do in the first place. They get on their knees and on their faces before God. They lay prostrate, seeking God's counsel. And by the way, that's a very appropriate place to be, is on our knees and on our faces. And we can say what we want about the Islamic religion, Islamic faith, and Muslims. But I think we have a lot to learn about how they pray. At least 5 times they get on their knees and on their faces prostrate before God, seeking His counsel. And as Moses and Aaron seek the counsel of the Lord, the glory of the Lord shows up. And God actually begins to speak in this posture of humility. And He says, I've heard you, Moses, and I see that the people are thirsty. And in fact, I'm going to do something about it. And isn't that interesting? God knew about their thirst, and He was waiting for a time such as this to show His faithful provision for His people. So God cares about our problems. God cares exactly for what you're going through, whatever it is. Whether it's sickness or disease or health or money or relationships are falling apart, God cares about it. And He's waiting to show up. And so He tells Moses, He says, Moses, I want you to take that staff, the staff that you did all the miracles with, and I want you to speak to the rock, gather the people, gather all the assembly, speak to the rock, and water will come out of the rock. Now that's pretty odd. God says, I want you to speak to a rock, and water will come out of the rock. And so Moses obeys God, partially. Moses gets the people together, and this is what he says. He says, listen up, you rebels. Right? He's tired of their complaining. He's been their leader all this time, and all he's heard is moaning and griping and complaining. And we've already seen how Moses has an anger problem. He killed an Egyptian. When he came off the mountain, he smashed the stone tablets. And so Moses is fired up. And so he calls them what he should have, really. He said, "You rebels." And by the way, that's a good reminder for all the parishioners that that's what the pastor says when you start complaining and moaning to him. He says, this is what the pastor says. Why don't you complain to God about it? Why don't you pray to God about it instead of calling us rebels? And so Moses says, "You rebels, listen up." And what does Moses do? Instead of speaking to the rock, he strikes the rock twice. And water comes gushing out. It's a miracle. Even though God said speak, Moses strikes the rock and water comes out. And this wasn't the first time that they dealt with a rock in thirst in the wilderness. If you go back to Exodus 17, the people had the same situation. They had no water, there was a rock, and God told Moses at that time to strike the rock once, and water would come out. And so this is round 2. They're in the wilderness, they don't have anything to drink, there's a rock, so Moses says, well, God said speak, but last time I struck the rock, so this time I'll just strike it twice, and out will come water. And that's exactly what happened. Out came water. But I think that's a good reminder to us that just because God chooses to act, and just because God chooses to bless us, doesn't necessarily mean that He's pleased with us. So just because you don't have any health issues, or you're doing okay financially, or all of your relationships are in order, and even though you might be doing some things that God's not pleased with, that's not necessarily an indication that God is pleased with you just because you're experiencing blessing. Because that's what happened to Moses. The water came out. And you say, well, what's the big deal? They were thirsty, water came out, everybody's happy. Well, you see, God's reputation has been on the line. And God will always be God despite us. In fact, in 2 Timothy 2:13, Paul says that even when we are faithless, God will remain faithful, for He cannot disown Himself. God will be faithful even when we are not, even when God's leaders are not. God says, my reputation is on the line, so I will bring the water, so that the people will know that I am God. And yet, because of the sinfulness of Moses, because he did not do exactly as God said, He said to Aaron and He said to Moses, you will not enter into the promised land. You may see it, but you will not enter it. And you say, well, big deal. No, this was a huge deal for Israel. They have been on the move for all these years, looking for the promised land, and now God says to the leaders, you will not enter it. You will not enter the promised land. And I want to direct your attention to why that is, because it's really important that we see this as well. It's Numbers 20, verse 12. And it says this, Moses and Aaron failed to trust in Him enough to honor Him as holy in the sight of the people. Moses and Aaron did not trust that what God said was the best way to go. And by doing so, they failed to honor Him as holy in the sight of the people. Now, did you know that above all else, above all the attributes and characteristics of God, God is holy. And to be holy means to be set apart and distinct. And in fact, right now, as we speak, and from the beginning of time until the end of time, God's angels are around His throne saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory. And so God is set apart, and He wants His people to be set apart. And He wants to be treated as holy and distinct. And Moses and Aaron failed to do that. And you and I have the obligation as God's kids, because His reputation is on the line, and we reflect what God looks like. And if God's holy, that's why God said, you be holy as I am holy. Because we reflect the holiness of God. And so because they failed to do that, They did not get to enter into the promised land. And you see, I think sometimes we think that when a holy God says something, he's just kind of joking around. Right? Yeah, God said something, but he's not serious. No, today we need to realize that when God says something, he's not playing around. He's dead serious. And yet we don't treat it like that oftentimes. And I hope that we get this, if nothing else this morning, that when God says something, and when he says he's going to do something, and when he gives us commands to love him with everything that we've got, and love your neighbor as yourself, and honor him with your whole life and your money, he literally means exactly what he says. And Moses, of all people, was not off the hook. And we're talking about Moses. This is what Deuteronomy says about Moses. No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Nobody did all the miracles and the signs and the wonders that God sent him to do. No one has ever done the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel. And that's the Moses that we're talking about, that did not get to enter the land. He said, you may see it, but you will not enter it. And what I want us to see is that if Moses was not off the hook, why should we be either? If Moses was not allowed to enter into the promised land, what does that say about you and I? Now let me say this about Moses, just in case you're wondering about his eternal security. Moses ultimately made it to the promised land in glory. Because if you remember in the New Testament, when Jesus and a couple of his disciples went to the mountain, and they got to see God and the glory of God, who was there with him? Moses and Elijah. So Moses eventually made it, but not while he was on this earth. Because to whom much is given, much is required. And what God requires of us is to honor him, he being our Father, as holy in the sight of the people. And so I hope that we take that with us this morning. And I hope that unlike Moses, we don't miss out on our promised land. And our promised land is to be with God forever, in eternity. To be with the glory of God, to see Jesus face to face, to dance on streets of gold. That's our promised land. That's what we're looking forward to. But God's dead serious. That if we fail to honor him as holy, and we fail to honor him with who he is, and we fail to be repentant, we will miss out on our promised land. And guys, we've got to know that God's reputation is on the line. We as his kids are to reflect what he looks like in our offices, with our parents, with our kids. God's reputation is on the line. And so I pray that we would honor him as holy. That we would, as Scripture says, carry around with us the aroma of Christ. Do you realize that? You and I are supposed to smell like Jesus. We're supposed to look like Jesus so that when people see us, they don't just see you, but they see Jesus. So I pray that we heed God's warning this morning, that we would not fail to enter into our promised land, and that in every solitary thing that we do, we would honor God as holy. Let's pray.